Ryan Schultz here from E39 Source. Welcome back to another YouTube video. And this starts a series, a hotly and highly requested series. This is my dad's 2006 E60 M5 SMG with 115,000 miles on an original pump. And that pump has bit the dust, as we say. So it's being swapped over to a Getrag manual out of an E92 M3. So I had initially thought I was going to do this in one video, and that's a joke because that would be an 8-day-long video. So we're going to do it in a couple different segments, a couple different clips. I ask you to bear with me. I know this is E39 Source, not E60 Source. This one, there's going to be a lot of me talking. There's not going to be a lot of meat and potato and DIY stuff in here. But if you're considering this job, if you're just interested in the journey, if you're curious at just how crazy we have to be to attempt something like this, stay tuned. That's kind of what this video is going to be, the preface, a little bit of explanation and some teardown. You guys know me for 10 years of E39 M5 content, and that's not going away. I still have this car. I'm still daily driving it. We've got them all over the place here. Nothing's changing in that regard. There will be a lot of videos on this channel about the manual swap on the E60 M5 simply because I don't have another place to put them. If you're not interested in the E60 M5, I get that. I respect that. Just don't watch them. That is totally fine with me. If you are interested, of course, I welcome you here whenever I upload. So here in video one, let's see, it is April 27th, 2020. We're right in the middle of COVID. This has been an absolute blast, and I need something to take my time and to give me something to work for. And boy, did we pick a winner. So about 2 weeks ago, I'm driving this car up here. I guess we'll talk about symptoms. I drove it up. I live 15 miles south of here in San Diego, California. I'm in Escondido in our shop right now, and I went to leave. I got in the car and it wouldn't start. The 1 on the cluster was flashing, and then the N would flash, and it was just, it could not figure out what gear it was in or make any changes. So yeah, we could have replaced the pump. We probably could have topped up the fluid and checked the lines, and there was a little bit of a leak on the old SMG transmission, which I'll show you. So we could have had some other issues there, but we've known for a while the SMG, they don't last real long. They're not fun to drive. And if you're driving the car at 10 tenths and your foot's in it at 8,800 RPM, the thing shifts like crazy. I mean, it's decent for that. For around town driving, the way this car is used up and down the 15 here in California all the time, it's not good. So this is not going to be a debate about if the SMG sucks or not. In our opinion, it does. We own the car, we're changing it. So you can use a transmission from an E90 M3. It will bolt up to the back of the block. The difference is the E9X M3 transmission manual has these two, and I'm assuming they're these. Bear with me here, I'm learning along this process. Those two blue caps are stoppers for a cooler that the E90 M3 has and the E60 M5 does not. So we're going to have to fabricate a way to block those off somehow. The rest of the transmission Bellhousing gearbox is all the same. This is off of a 2008 E92 M3 6-speed, 56,000 miles from New Jersey. There's a little bit of salt corrosion on it. It's aluminum. It's not going to rust out. Still has all the M3 shifter linkage on here. That is an E60 M5 flex disc that I put on there, and I think we're able to use that same bracket since this transmission is shorter than the SMG. The SMG is longer. It's got 7 forward gears. This only has 6. I assume that's why. So we'll talk more about the specifics of that when we're ready to put it on. The SMG is out. Yes, I'm starting the video now. I do have a couple clips from before. I'll put them in here when applicable. So far, we've done the teardown on the car. I'll get it up in the air in a minute. We've removed the exhaust. We've removed the drive shaft, the heat shielding, the transmission, and the flywheel. I have also, just today, taken apart the DME box a little bit to remove the SMG ECU and isolate the wires from the SMG wiring harness. And this is the part that runs from the DME box to the transmission. And unfortunately, BMW doesn't give this sucker a part number. There's a ton of used ones here for the SMGs available on eBay, but I have yet to find a manual one. So I have an idea that we're probably going to be fabricating that here in-house with help from this SMG harness. We'll cannibalize that one and make the manual harness. This is a huge video. I know you guys are going to get so sick of me talking, but boy, does it take a lot of research to do this. And there's an extremely helpful thread online, and Alex up in Long Beach has been a tremendous help to me. I want to give him a thanks right now. I would not be attempting this if it weren't for someone who's willing to help me, who's done it before, who has firsthand experience, and is as technical and resourceful as he is. So I will link, if he wants me to, his Instagram and the post and everything in the description to this video. But kind of a general overview. There's a mechanical aspect of this job, which obviously means changing the flywheel. Yes, it's different. The clutch, the pressure plate, the throwout bearing, the transmission, the drive shaft changes, and that's kind of it for driveline mechanical. We do have to change, obviously, the shifter linkage, the shifter carrier, the selector rod, all the stuff that makes a manual work. We need to add a clutch pedal, a hydraulic line, a slave cylinder, adjust the brake booster. I don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but we'll get there eventually. So that's kind of the overview of the mechanicals. That's not inclusive of everything. I'm still well on my way here. And then there's, of course, an electronic aspect of the job that I just can't wait to get in. That's going to be so miserable. You've got to program the cluster and the DME and all of this stuff to know that it's a manual. A couple problems with that. This was made day 2 of E60 M5 production for North America. Day 2, September 2nd, 2005. It's an 06 model year. It's a totally base car. It does not have one single option on it. Thank God the M5s came well optioned. It's the 94th M5 made for North America. So therefore, it does not know that in 2007 sometime, BMW did offer the E60 M5 in a manual. It's option code S2MAA. And that option code, I don't know exactly how many were made, a couple hundred. There's about 20,000 E60 M5s made for North America. A couple hundred of them got the manual, I think. So BMW did support it. They did make all the parts. If they did not ever put a manual in this car, I highly doubt I would be willing to take the project on. But since they did, they wrote the software, they wrote the code, they made the parts, I feel like this is much more palatable. Having said that, it's a low production car in general. And then the S2MAA manual option is extremely low production, and it's been now over 10 years since the E60 M5 stopped production. So today and moving forwards, there's going to be a lot of parts that are really challenging to come across and to source, and we've already run into some problems with this. We were able to score the second to last flywheel available in the world for over $1,800. That's what a flywheel costs now. It's in this box. Yes, it is different. No, you cannot use the stock E60 SMG flywheel, which is over here. The two in the back are E39 M5 flywheels. This is the E60 SMG flywheel, which is original to the car. It had 115 on it. I'm really surprised at how small the surface areas are here. The SMG clutch we had just done like 9,000 miles ago, of course, and it looks like that. This SMG is for sale. It needs a hydraulic pump. Other than that, it was shifting really well once we got that new clutch on there, and all of that's new, and they did, well, I already robbed the Jubo, but the rest of it's clean. It doesn't seem to leak anything. There were a couple little drops on one of the hydraulic lines, so it probably needs a washer in there, but otherwise, it is a good transmission if someone's interested. The drive shaft is the thing we've really struggled with. So this is the SMG drive shaft. The SMG transmission is 31 millimeters longer than the manual, so that I'm measuring it from the front of the bell housing where it mates to the engine block to the output shaft where the flex disc or juba would bolt on. And then you do the same thing on the manual, the E60 M5 manual or the E90 M3 manual, and it's 31 millimeters shorter, the manual is. So that means you need a drive shaft that's 31 millimeters longer, and it needs to be in between the center support bearing and the input shaft, or the input of the drive shaft, or the output of the transmission. So 31 millimeters in here, which is roughly 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches. So BMW made a drive shaft, of course, for the manual E60 M5. I found the part number. It's not available new anywhere. It's not available used anywhere. It's not on wrecked cars. It doesn't exist. If you get lucky and your neighbor just wrecked his E60 M5, you should go and offer him a bunch of money for it, because you're not going to find one somewhere else. Our plan will be to take this drive shaft, which was just serviced with a fresh CSB and CV joint on the rear, to a local drive shaft shop, have them extend this segment or refabricate this segment or refabricate the whole thing. I don't know what the plan is yet. But for about $600, they will create us a custom drive shaft measured to fit and balance it. This is a ridiculously massive project, so I don't have every single step laid out in front of me, 1 through 10, 1 through 1,000, like I normally do in my DIYs. My DIYs are kind of geared towards somebody that has never worked on these cars before. I want them to be easy enough to follow that a 5th grader who knows how to turn a screwdriver could complete the DIY successfully. This one will not be like that. This video, if you are attempting, if you're even considering attempting doing an SMG to manual swap, I trust that you already know how to remove an exhaust system and a drive shaft and open a DME box and hook up your laptop with NCS and multiple other pieces of software I'm sure we're going to need throughout this. If you don't, find someone who can, find a shop, find a friend. I'm not going to spell this out letter by letter for you, which is kind of why I'm already starting here. You need to be able to get here. You need to be able to remove the drive shaft and the heat shields and the belly pans, and none of it's rocket science. It's all pretty simple. It's all just a bunch of bolts. And I'm pretty anal with this stuff, so I have labeled everything with a date, a step number, and then a descriptor of what is in the bag. So the first thing we removed there, I call it the Patrick Star, but it's the transmission belly pan. It's this piece, which does change for the manual. My thinking is they just get rid of this cooler fin because this feeds the cooler on the bottom of the SMG transmission. So maybe we'll be able to snap this thing off and reuse it and not have to spend $500 on a new one. I don't know. Stay tuned, like 5 more videos, we'll figure it out. Then we have engine bay belly pan, which is the plastic one down here, and that's just a bunch of big, 10 millimeter nuts, 8 millimeter bolts. Then we have the front cross member brace. This metal piece here is a bunch of 13s or 16s. Center exhaust brace, the muffler bolts. Now, we have a muffler delete on this car, so we took the exhaust off from the headers back. There are Torx bolts up here. There's just 2 on each side. And all the way down, there's another fastening point there at the center support brace. It's the same as the E39. That's the chassis braces are here, and there's just 2 13 millimeter bolts on each side. And then nothing through the resonator, and then the muffler delete, and then we just have 1 nut on each side holding up the tips. If you still have the scuba tanks on here, it'll be a bunch more hardware, but none of it's difficult. The exhaust came off quite easily. This is a Southern California car. It's never seen salt, it's never seen snow, to the best of our knowledge. So everything came out really well. And I wish the same for you. The muffler hardware is here, as I said. Exhaust to header hardware. You know, it's just an easy way to keep all this stuff together. Drive shaft tunnel heat shields. You got one big one, you got little ones, you got even smaller ones, you got these things. They're going to be a pain to put back together. Then the drive shaft, I put everything in one bag. Drive shaft uses a lot of torque to yield bolts. The 3 bolts that connect this to the jubo, and then the 3 bolts that connect the jubo to the transmission output shaft, all of that hardware should be replaced. The hardware that connects the CV joint to the diff, those are Torx bolts, they should also be replaced. I'm putting together a spreadsheet of parts. It's going to be huge. I'm just trying to keep everything organized. I will finish that. I will finalize that sometime this late spring, summer when we finish this job, and I'll put a link to it in all these different videos. But right now that's not ready, so please don't ask me for it. I'm just uploading this so you guys have something to watch here through the pandemic. Then, yeah, I already got the new hardware. It's just here in bags stapled to the old hardware. Front cats, O2 sensor brackets go on the transmission. Quick note on that, I'm sure I'll talk about it again. This M3 transmission did not have the stud for the bracket for the O2 sensors. See that stud sticking out there in the middle of the screen? It's literally just a threaded stud, and it threads into that hole on the side of the transmission, and there's another one just like it over here. So I had to rob those from the SMG using the double nut method. Take 2 nuts, put them together, and then put a wrench on it. Just move the studs over to facilitate oxygen sensor bracket installation. Trans Bellhousing bolts. That was a bit of a story. While I have the transmission off, I will show you. I think there's 2 more than you think. So at the very top of the transmission, there is a hole. Don't touch that. That's for the starter motor. So don't do the one at 12 o'clock. You're going to be looking at it from this angle. To facilitate transmission removal, and I have a clip from this, the transmission actually and the engine rotate back like this about 10 or 15 degrees. So the engine can freely move in the engine bay. Just be careful with it. Don't slam it around. And then the transmission drops down, and that's how you can access the top 6 bolts. So the one at 12 o'clock there, don't touch that. There's 2 here, there's 2 here, there's 1 there, and there's 1 there, and they're all external Torx 12 or 14 mils. I did not know about the inner 2 there, so boy was that difficult trying to remove a transmission when it still had Bellhousing bolts in it. So make sure you remove all 6 from the top, and then the bottom ones are really simple to get to. They're just around the whole casing. They're all the same except these 2. These 2 are visibly different. It's pretty simple. You shouldn't need to replace those unless you mangle the heads on them. And be careful with the heads. They're E-Torx. If you round one of those, you might be pulling the motor. Here on the M3 manual, it's the same deal. talking about SMG removal. So we want to leave the Bellhousing bolts in the bottom of the transmission. There are about 10 or 12 of these E-Torx, external Torx 12mm bolts. We're going to leave these bottom 4 or 6 in. We're going to focus on the top ones first. And we want to support the back of the transmission here. I've left the bracket on the transmission and the mounts in between the transmission and the bracket. We're going to leave the 13 mils down here. And then we're going to remove the 6, 3 on each side, 13mm hex bolts that are holding the bracket to the chassis. Now that we've done that, we're actually going to be able to lower the back of the transmission and the engine, since they're still connected, about 10 or 15 degrees down. And that's going to give us access to those top 4 bolts or top 6 bolts that are going to be tricky to access. At this point now, we are ready to start to lower the transmission and engine. We can see that the exhaust is moving with it. There's no bad noises. This is all very smooth. And we're going to come down until it's evident that it's down as far as it wants to go. And that's going to give us just enough room on top to use some very long extensions. I have a whole table's worth of 3/8 extensions here and the E-Torx 12. And we're not going to use that impact gun. We're going to do this by hand with the breaker bar there. And just put together as many extensions as we need. Some locking ones might help, a wobble might help. I'll try to shove the camera up there. We can see a bolt at 12 o'clock. That is the bolt that holds the starter motor in there. Do not take that bolt out. We want to remove those 2 bolts in this view that are at 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock. I got to give it to BMW here on the E60. These trick motor mounts that allow for the engine and the transmission to hang back like this is very cool. So we're ready to remove those top ones. I think that's going to be easy. Then the other bolts we're going to be pulling out are hiding right up there. It is that Torx above the black connector. So that one will be a little bit trickier. We might need a U-joint or something like that. So trans Bellhousing bolts, we talked about that. Trans rear brace. There's a brace on the back of the transmission and the front of the transmission. You got this thing. I don't know if we're going to be reusing that or not. Probably we'll swap over. We'll see. This is the trans rear bracket. The SMG pressure plate, these are totally different bolts. We're not going to be reusing these. And then I come over here, step 17, I have the passenger side O2 sensor bracket for the side of the transmission. And then today, DME box is just held on with a bunch of 5mm Allens. So I open up the DME box, and we need to disconnect the SMG harness from where it plugs into the car. And I have isolated the SMG harness right here. It consists of this backmost bracket. At first I tried just taking off all the individual things. That's more work than it's worth. All you want to do is release a Phillips head screw in the shadows there, right here. Release that Phillips head screw, and then there's a tab that's holding this thing, this plastic bracket in the DME box, and release the tab and then just pull the whole thing up, and that comes off. Then you've got this plug, and you've got a couple plugs that go into the SMG ECU, and then the whole thing comes out like this, and you can see it's detached from the rest of the electronics. We're going to be spending a lot of time here, probably in a few weeks. I'm not looking forward to it at all, but we'll figure it out. The SMG ECU looks like this, and it will not be going back in the car. So I mentioned that this car has trick engine mounts that allows the engine to dip down and give you access to those top transmission bolts. And when you do that, I know it's not good on these things. If it messes them up, we'll replace them, but the engine actually becomes quite loose in the car, but it's by design. Get a look under the car in this first video here. So the part number for the diff doesn't change. It's the same between the SMG and the manual. The rear subframe part number does for some reason change. I don't quite understand why. But the people that have done it say you don't need to change it, so we're not. If there's problems with that, if I learn more in the future, I will let you know. We'll get a look at the front of the diff. It's nice and clean. It has 4 mounts instead of the 3 that the E39 has. We did replace that input seal a couple years ago, so it's nice and dry. We don't need to mess with anything past that. Here in the transmission tunnel, let me first give a couple of impressions working on this car. I have obviously worked on the E60 M5 before, but certainly not in this capacity before. Impressions after working on the E39 for a lot of years, it's really well built. This car's a little bit better engineered. It had to be. This is a legitimate 200-mile-an-hour car. It's got this V10 shoehorned in here. I mean, they had to make some improvements, and technology and CAD and things like that do allow for improvement. So we can see more seam sealer on specific areas in the chassis. Things are generally a little bit tighter, a little bit better put together. So we were able to remove everything in here, taking our grand old time and being very careful pretty easily. So that was a good sign. But as we move forwards, these are the chassis braces. I just moved them out of the way. I didn't take them down. The center support bearing for the drive shaft now facing the rear bolted in here. So that came out nice and easily. And then looking at the back of the engine, we can see the starter motor up there at 12 o'clock. That does not move, it does not change. The manual transmission setup was the same, which is nice. We are gonna do a rear main seal while we're here. We've done all the labor to do a rear main seal, and as far as I know, that one is original. It's a little bit wet in here. I know the valve cover gaskets are leaking, and I think that some of that has worked its way down here to where the bell housing mates up. The exhaust gas temperature sensors, each cylinder bank of exhaust has one of those. They can stay in place. Same thing with both oxygen sensors here, both post-cat O2s and I guess the pre-cats too, because they're way up there. Obviously they need to be unplugged. These are the plugs here that will be when we're plugging those in, we're in good shape. Here's the passenger side. And they go into the brackets I showed you on the side of the transmission. The SMG wiring harness is this, everything in my hands. So we've got this big round connector, the white one, a tiny little one, kind of a larger one, and then a longer one down here that's also quite small. And all of that is somehow going to need to go up. It snakes behind that heat shield, so I imagine that will be the next thing I remove under here. Important to say here, this part of the harness goes from the DME to here, and then there's a junction, so you can remove the transmission. And then there's another wiring harness that unfortunately was not included with this M3 transmission, but it plugs into everything on the transmission. The neutral switch is up here at the top. I'm not exactly sure what this one is yet. This is the pump that I don't think we can delete, but since this is going in an M5, it won't be doing much. Reverse sensor, you know, whatever else is on here. That part of the harness does have a part number, and it kind of still exists until we just bought the last one in the world from Germany. So sorry about that. You're gonna have to find a used one, or maybe they'll make more if you get lucky. It's a couple weeks out, but that part of the harness will snap onto the transmission using different clips. The clips are here. When we get the wiring harness, I'll figure out exactly where they go, put the clips on, snap the wiring harness on here. Then, when we lift this up into the car and install it, obviously after we do the rear main seal, put the new pressure plate on, or put the new flywheel on, and then the clutch and pressure plate assembly and throwout bearing and anything else we're going to service with this transmission while it's off, then we'll simply be able to plug in the transmission to the car harness, but that's going to be the part we've got to make, and that probably needs to be in place. It definitely needs to be in place before we install the transmission, so we're a ways away on that. A minute ago I didn't know what I was talking about this harness that's hanging off the top of the engine. This is for your exhaust gas temp sensors, your post-cat O2s, your pre-cat O2s, and then finally the seventh and final connector on here is for your crank sensor, which is on the transmission. None of this will change between SMG and manual. For anybody wondering about the linkage logistics, BMW was very kind and they left us what we needed here. This is a perforated punch that we'll be removing from the top. I think it'll be easier that way. And then that's going to give us access to the hole that's already cut in the chassis and ready to have a manual shifter put through it. Another whole aspect that I have not even talked about yet is going to be the inside work. There's a lot of stuff that needs to change inside the car. So this is a pre-facelift, so it has this button panel down there at the bottom, similar to the E39. That houses your heated seat button, your PDC. This one has the tire pressure monitoring button there, and then hiding in the shadow there is the driver's side heated seat button. The E60 M5 was also available with perforated or climate-controlled seats. We don't have that, nor do we have the adjustable or the manually automatically adjustable, these things, they would turn when you move the car. I think both of those features on this car were very poorly implemented, so I'm not sour about not having them. It'd be nice to fill the panel out, but it's unnecessary since we don't have the feature. So what you're going to have to do is decide if you're either going to facelift this whole thing here to the newer style that has two vertical rows of buttons on the left and right, or find a replacement switch that replaces your TPMS button with the MDM button. And the MDM button is what takes over, I believe, our DSC configuration and then the power modes. It's like a shortcut maybe to that menu on the iDrive. I don't know yet since I've never played with one of these cars as a manual. So this is the panel for us. This is the one that we wanted. We wanted the one that keeps our heated seat button, keeps the PDC button, and replaces the TPMS with MDM. No manual E60 M5 will have a TPMS button here. It's moved into the iDrive. We deleted the sensors years ago because they're too expensive, so we're just going to code the whole system out at this time. This is the panel that we ended up getting incredibly lucky enough online. I don't know how we managed to find this on eBay for like 80 bucks in Florida. This thing new's about $400, and we were prepared to probably have to buy it new because this stuff does not exist. This would be for a pre-facelift E60 M5 manual, and somehow we found it. We found it used, so I wish you the best of luck with that. Since we're deleting that monstrosity, we're going to lose the power button, the DSC button, and the EDC button, and the adjuster for the shift settings there, but that's okay because we won't care about that anymore. The power button, I think those preferences moved to MDM. DSC, I believe that's also an MDM. And then the EDC button, BMW got a little tricky, and these cup holders here, or these, this is an ashtray, that was replaced with a little mini ashtray slash storage cubby, and the EDC button moves up there. So we have that part on order. It's like 70 bucks new. It's coming from Germany. I don't know how many are left, but probably not many. So the EDC button will move up there and replace that ashtray. The rest of the center console can stay. That does not change. And since this is an early car, it's CI or it's CCC navigation, not CIC. Now would be a great time to change the center console and retrofit that in the new controller in the computer if you want to. The CIC is a vast improvement. We just don't use it either way. We've got NBT in the F10 and never use it, so we're not going to bother with that. I haven't really done much work inside the car at all yet. I fear we're going to need to be removing the entire dashboard, removing pieces of the carpeting, potentially cutting the carpeting to access the pedal box here to put a clutch in there. Notice that the SMG does have a manual brake pedal. Like, that's the manual brake pedal. The automatic brake pedal is about 1.5 inches or 2 inches wider than that. So I don't know if we'll be able to get away with just adding a clutch pedal or if we're going to have to change the entire pedal box. I'm not there yet. I know we're going to have to run hydraulic lines and stuff under the carpeting. We probably need to remove the driver's seat, the yaw sensors under there. That was pinned directly to the SMG ECU. I think that's got to be moved to the DME. This will all be stuff coming in later videos. I'm just trying to give you guys kind of an overview of what's going to happen in the future, what this looks like, and where we are now. April 28th, a few updates. We got the manual transmission wiring harness today from Germany. This was the last one available worldwide, so sorry if you're trying to do this DIY. No, I hope they make more at some point. It's 2301 7840 637 is the part number. This thing was 100 and something bucks. Took about 7 days to get here from Germany, which is pretty good in the middle of a pandemic. So the only modification that will be required for this thing is moving pin 10 to pin 4. That's 10 to 4. And we got to do that because this is just the transmission side of the harness. It fits on the transmission, and then it just ends up with a large connector, and that connector needs to plug into the car harness. Now, the car harness isn't really replaceable. You'd have to strip the vehicle to the chassis, and M5s that came with a manual transmission had that little pigtail that ran down and then plugged into this / the transmission. That was part of the main loom. You can't buy a secondary loom. It was part of the main loom. Unlike the SMG, where you have this wiring harness that originates in the DME box and then runs down through the firewall to the transmission and plugs into the transmission. This is its own harness. It has its own part number. It's a lovely little piece of kit. That doesn't exist. So we've got to fabricate now the piece that goes from the transmission harness to the DME box. Thankfully, on the SMG harness, we have a connector that is well populated with pins that plugs in directly to the connector in question on the SMG harness, the biggest, or on the 6-speed manual harness, the biggest connector in question. The only problem is we've got to move 10 to 4 because this one doesn't have a 10, but it has a 4, so we just move 10 to 4 and remember that. And we're no longer going off of official BMW pinouts. We're making our own. Now you've got to trace these 7 wires that you're going to need, because there's only 7 wires in here. So trace them using a voltmeter and continuity test up through the harness over to the DME portion. I'll tell you right now, they're all in the gray block. And I just did a little diagram here that we'll get on camera. It's a little bit tricky to read since you guys didn't make it, but I made it and I know how to read it. On the left is the manual transmission harness where it will plug into the car. On the right is the SMG end of the SMG harness connector that I showed you that will fit. And we had to move 10 to 4 because we don't have a 10 over here, but we do have a 4, as I mentioned before. So I figured out the colors over here and then what they are, what they're responsible for doing. You can see the big arrow tells us that we have to move 10 to 4 for the gearbox temperature ground. And then the numbers in squares, 34, 4, 4, 21, 12, 4, 34, 8, and 9, those are tracing the pins from the one connector that we're going to be using up to the gray part that plugged in the SMG ECU. So maybe it's a little bit easier to see over here. So on the manual harness, pin 1 is going to go to SMG DME on the black block into pin 34. 2 into 4, 3 into 4. How are they the same? It's a grounding block. They're just all put together in a crimp with a screw cap on it. So we're just going to have to separate them and put pins on them and figure out where they need to go. The wires are already run through that harness. Essentially, we're just going to cut out the crap we don't need, leave the rest in there, and figure out how to pin it into the DME box using the SMG harness, cannibalizing, rather, the SMG harness. I'm going to give you guys some updates here on May 4th. I put the transmission side of the harness on the transmission. It goes on nice and neat. There's 3 clips that you can see, the one here and one here. There's one on the other side. So the harness only has 4 plugs on it, and one of them is a feed plug that will plug into to the car, what's going up to the DME box. You've got your reverse switch back here. Then you've got your neutral sensor on top. And on the driver's side of the transmission is the oil temp sensor down here, and there's where that extra clip goes, and then it routes here behind the slave cylinder. So pretty neat installation onto the transmission itself. There's still one more, there's actually 2 more sensors that are on the transmission that will need to be connected to the car. Number 1 is the main crank sensor out here on the outer tip of the bell housing. That is on the engine loom. It's going to be an easy plug and play. It's the same for the manual and the SMG. The second sensor is over here. This is a RPM sensor for the transmission itself, and it uses a little 3-pin. So on the SMG harness, there's an additional 2 plugs that we're going to be using on the transmission side of the harness. Number 1 is the 3-pin connector that's going to go here. Now that's supposed to be on the engine loom, but we'll figure out how to pin it into the DME. So that's the 3-pin. So you don't want to cut that off the trans side of the SMG harness. And 2, this is optional. If you want to use the oil cooler, the oil pump, and put a cooler in somewhere, you're going to use your 2-pin little black harness for that. If you don't, and you don't need to, because the E60 M5 didn't come with a transmission cooler, and before everybody freaks out, oh, it needs one. This car runs up and down the highway all day at 3,500 RPM. Sometimes it goes fast. That's it. We don't take it to a track. It's very rarely over 6,500 RPMs. So there's absolutely no need for us to retrofit that, so we're not going to. But if you want to, then leave your 2-pin, again, on the SMG harness trans side, which I actually put back in the car. In fact, I would recommend that you don't remove it. It's just unnecessary work. You can cut off anything you want up here, and you can cut off anything you want at the bottom end. There's no need to have it out of the car for that. And we'll talk about the pins up top here, a little hard to read. The 2-pin black, it has 2 pins, 1 and 2. That is the pump cooler on the transmission, and they go to a green relay at the DME box and then the gray 2-pin for ground. Now the 3-pin black connector at the SMG side of the SMG harness is the black connector that goes to the transmission RPM sensor. It's got 3 pins. Number 1 goes to the 8-pin DME side, pin number 5. Pin number 2 goes to the 8-pin DME side, pin number 6. Pin number 3 goes to the SMG, the gray block, and number 11. So I went ahead and marked those wires too, just in case I want to use them. I'll probably leave the 2-pin in there in case somebody wants to retrofit that in the future. I'll just tape it up and stick it out of the way. Now I'm about to do a little bit of a trip. I know it's not a great time for it, but duty calls. And I'm going to be away for a little bit. We're still waiting on parts. So this is going to end part 1. We talked about some disassembly. We talked about some parts that are needed. And we're going to get into really the wiring meat and potatoes in the next series. And then probably some installation of the rear main seal, of the pilot bearing, of the flywheel, of the clutch and pressure plate and throwout bearing, and kind of preparing the car for a mechanical installation. I think that's where we're going to go. Maybe we tear the interior apart and work on the SCM switch and put the pedals in and the brake booster. I don't know what's coming next. Stay tuned. But this is part 1. I don't want to make these things really, really, really long. So that's where we are. If you have any constructive criticism or words of advice, feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, I'll talk to you in the next E39 source video. Take care. Wish me luck.